We are very fortunate today to have Shannon Heyck-Williams from the National Wildlife Federation with us. So as everybody knows, at CCL, we know solving climate change requires a variety of policies and perspectives. This is why we work together under a big tent. That includes folks from the left, the right, and every spot in between. Our Big Tent Climate Talk episodes are here. We present them to talk to a wide variety of climate leaders outside of CCL to learn more about how we can all be in this movement and work together. For those of you that don't know, my name is Kammien, and I'm the Senior Business Relations Representative for CCL. I work here in our DC office. My work focuses on building the coalition of businesses and industry partners in our Big Tent. Overall, our DC team keeps a pulse on what other organizations are doing and find ways that CCL can collaborate or work with them. It is my hope that our session today gives you a taste of how our team's conversations with other organizations go. For our episode today, as I mentioned, we're really pleased to have Shannon Heyck-Williams, Senior Director of Climate and Energy Policy at the National Wildlife Federation with us. But before I officially introduce Shannon, I want to cover a few gentle reminders of our ground rules. As CCLers, we love our focus, but we are also open-minded. Today's focus is on listening and learning from the experiences of fellow climate advocates. If you bump into a moment or a reaction where someone shares something you feel differently about, really lean into that and listen and see it as an opportunity to learn about the larger climate movement and better understand different perspectives. In that vein, building policy or support for the policy that we support, we know that it will require the biggest and broadest coalition possible. And that's the reason we want to host conversations like these. Learning more from each other and working together is how we get the job done. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's guest. A bit more about Shannon. Shannon Heyck-Williams serves as NWF's lead climate and energy policy advisor, directing and representing the organization's strategic priorities at the federal level as they relate to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and promoting renewable energy. She joined NWF in November of 2015, having worked for nearly 8 years performing government relations for the Pew Charitable Trust on projects pertaining to clean energy, agricultural use of antibiotics, and other environmental and public health issues. Shannon also served as the Deputy Global Warming Campaign Director for the National Environmental Trust, a research fellow at the Pew Center on Climate Change, and a professional staff member focusing on climate change and air quality issues for former Chairman Jim Jeffords on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. So Shannon, is there anything else you'd like folks to know on this call and that I might have missed?
No, that seems pretty comprehensive. And hello, Susan. I'm also from suburban Chicago. I saw that in the chat. I love seeing where it's from. That's awesome.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're so happy to have you with us today. It's nice to work with organizations that recognize the power of carbon pricing and other policies that we can put in place to reduce emissions and working toward this policy, getting those policies implemented together. With that said, let's transition our conversation over to the questions so I can do less talking. And for our audience, just as a reminder, don't worry, we've saved time at the bottom of the event for audience Q&A. For this first part, I'll be asking Shannon some questions on her perspectives and experiences that we've already teed up, but feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will get to them as we can towards the end of the event. So Shannon, the first question I have for you is pretty broad and general question. How did you get into the climate space and climate movement?
Yeah, well, it's been a while now. I've been in this space for about 20 years, which is kind of hard to imagine. But I think really kind of my environmental awakening, if you will, really happened first on a trip I took with my mom when I was in high school to the cloud forest of Costa Rica. So going way back, I grew up in suburban Chicago, like I mentioned, and I was just completely blown away by the lushness of the forest and all of the wildlife everywhere. And but also how it was sort of described to us as we were walking through about how people were so interconnected with, and really depending on the health of the forest. And so my interest kind of in environmentalism generally just sort of grew from there and then really kind of moved off into the climate movement where I found I could really combine my, mutual passions for protecting forests and wildlife, but also human health and sort of general well-being. And it's, climate is just one of those issues that's just endlessly fascinating. And it really is a perfect example of how we're totally dependent on our environment, our own, safety and security, but also how we can affect something as, as immense as the climate, right? And how much impact a single human being can have is really also kind of mind-blowing. So that plus that you just, have something new you can always learn about climate change. Some of it is a little scary, but it's always eternally fascinating and, never boring. So yeah, never change course really.
I can agree with some of it's a little scary portion.
Yeah.
Funny enough that you mentioned Costa Rica in particular. I also had the opportunity in high school to travel to Costa Rica with my father, and remember being blown away by just like the beauty of it and the ecological diversity, like something I had never seen before in my entire life. I'm from suburban Missouri outside of St. Louis. So, very Midwest. You don't see that kind of, plant life and things there. So I can understand why that moved you. So
Yeah.
great story. Well, then, moving on to more specifically your work at NWF, what projects and areas of focus typically does NWF work on related to climate?
Yeah, so we are a national nonprofit organization. We have affiliates which are not really chapters, they're actually independent organizations, and they establish policy actually for our federation. And so we work on a range of conservation issues, but also climate. And of course, it's all totally interrelated. And then within climate, we actually have sort of two major areas of work that are also related to both climate mitigation and adaptation or resilience. My area that I lead is on climate mitigation policy, and it's focused on the domestic level, at the federal level. And so that work is really focused on cutting greenhouse gas emissions in the US through advancing different sorts of federal policies like clean energy and industry policy. We do a lot of work on carbon capture and removal, and also on natural climate solutions. Like, well, that's a whole range of things too, but forest restoration might be one of those that's most obvious. So we've weighed in on a variety of proposals, everything from a clean energy standard to working with labor partners on a clean manufacturing tax credit, for example, to advocating for advanced research and development funding for new technologies, direct air capture, all kinds of different strategies. And then, of course, we spend a lot of time also trying to shape a lot of these policies so that they particularly address needs of the traditionally fossil fuel oriented communities or energy transition, however you might call them, like coal mining towns, and also other kinds of disadvantaged communities, and work closely with coalitions like in Appalachia or the West or with tribes across the country to try and elevate those unique needs within all of these sort of policy dialogues. And then, of course, we work on carbon pricing too. So we still believe in economy-wide approaches as much as possible. Although it doesn't seem quite as in vogue as a lot of the sector-based stuff these days. We do prefer a carbon fee in terms of the general pricing universe of options there, though we're more or less a little more agnostic over what form the price takes, just being happy to see anything that might take hold. But within that, we instead try to focus on sort of certain principles that we think are important to keep in mind, and then trying to educate policymakers about the benefits of pricing. So yeah, so that's our portfolio.
So only a few things.
Only a few.
But no, I think, there are a lot of things that you mentioned there that I think that, NWF and CCL definitely share both we believe in the policies, we believe in similar policies and their effectiveness, and also just kind of share that we work on those same things. I think you were mentioning some of the more natural solutions, soil carbon sequestration opportunities, things like that CCL has worked on as well. And obviously the fee and dividend side that we've historically been strong proponents of. So, we're really fortunate to have an organization like NWF that, also is working so hard on those things. It helps a lot. So an interesting question that we like to ask, because I think every organization kind of runs into it from time to time. There's like a narrative out there about the organization. It's maybe not accurate. So what do people assume about you or NWF that isn't actually true and kind of is a challenge in your work as a result?
That's a funny question. Well, let's see. I guess one thing that comes to mind most immediately is that those who are somewhat familiar with National Wildlife Federation probably just assume we're only a collection of hunters and fishermen, so anglers. And that therefore we're, I guess, less likely to be engaged on or care about climate change because it's, presumably more kind of a traditional or conservative audience. And so there's a kernel of truth there, which is that we do have a number of members who are hunters and anglers, recreationally or otherwise. But we also represent all kinds of other people who just enjoy and treasure the outdoors for other kinds of reasons. So and that includes city dwellers, suburban backyard birders, ranchers, farmers, all kinds, and then also just fans of Ranger Rick. We're the Ranger Rick magazine people, which it's amazing how many people know about us only because of that.
Effective marketing tool.
Yeah, who knew? In fact, I was just in a call the other day where we had Ranger Rick actually in the meeting room meeting with us, which was, that's fun. But it's not true that because of that background, we aren't as concerned about, or our membership's not as concerned about climate change. Obviously, people who are close to the outdoors and really track sort of what's going on in their natural environment or what's happening to the trout in the stream they like to fish in, or what's how the forest is being taken over by other kinds of invasive species or whatever it is. We are hearing more and more concern from people who really care about their natural world, that climate is having real life impacts on the things that they care about. And so that is something that actually is a tremendous power for us and a unique voice to bring to the table a lot of the time in climate conversation. So that's something that is perhaps not necessarily expected.
No, that's great. I think what you pointed to about more and more people seeing it in their day-to-day lives, I think we see that reflected a little bit in the political landscape, or the formation of like a conservative climate caucus in the House and groups like that, where it's less a conversation about is this happening and arguing if it's man-made or not, and more a conversation about, okay, what are the solutions, and challenging to come up with a consensus on a solution. But I think we've definitely, at least I think we've seen that pivot.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Yeah, I think that's very true. I think it's just a matter of the politicians catching up with the rest of us now. So I think the American public is ready to do something. Yeah.
Well, I think I know the answer to this, but what is NWF doing today or this week or this month?
Yes, well, today, like most of Washington, I think, and a lot of folks outside of Washington, we've been really tracking very closely and trying to influence the budget reconciliation bill in Congress. And it sounds like right before this call, the 1,700 page draft of this bill was actually just released. So I think a number of us will be looking at that later. In all seriousness, we've been very involved in just anything in the infrastructure space, of which this is basically in there too, to try to ensure that climate-related investments are part of what's considered infrastructure. So, investing in the next, generation of transmission lines that are needed to carry all the new renewable energy resources, hopefully, out to different regions of the country, installing charging infrastructure for all of the new EVs that hopefully everyone will be driving. And on and on. So there's a whole bunch of things that really go in that category of climate infrastructure or climate smart infrastructure. And for National Wildlife Federation, that also has included natural infrastructure. So things like living shorelines and other sorts of different restoration and resilience measures that you can do on the landscape, help protect people from climate impacts as well as absorb carbon emissions along the way. So these are all things we've been really focusing on, and tying them also to environmental justice. Now, all of these measures also help clean local environments and make them safer places to live, protect people from climate impacts and the like. And so we've also been pushing for within those, applying that lens of environmental justice to make sure that, we do no harm, but then also added sorts of investments to make sure that at least a portion of a lot of the investments go to communities that need them the most. So that's largely what we've been focusing on. And then, of course, the carbon fee. We have been, like you all, trying to convince folks that this is actually a great moment to include a carbon fee in what's immediately before Congress. It seems like a no-brainer, I think, to all of us, right? It's not only a way to meet climate goals, which we in the administration really, really want to do, and he's, I think, flying right now to Europe. Right. President Biden is going to be presenting our commitment. Our next commitments to the world on climate. This would be a great way to ensure that he meets those targets and raise billions and billions of dollars in revenue at the same time to help pay for a lot of priorities and protect people from any kind of cost changes. So it makes perfect sense to me and to us at National Wildlife Federation. So we've been also trying to argue that they should be part of the package too. So
yeah, and I think, as you mentioned about reaching the goals, I think a question that we have today, this moment, when I say we, the DC team here for CCL is, the administration seems to feel that the framework will meet a 50 to 52% reduction target, but it is unclear to us how it will achieve that. So, and that being the case, if there's a gap to close, obviously a fee can help. I know you agree with this, that the fee can help close that gap while also raising that revenue, and if should apportion some of that revenue to make sure that those that are already, facing challenging times paying their bills or whatever it might be are not left further behind. So we'll see what as we learn more about the framework, but I think ultimately to reach the goal, that's probably what we need. So no, thank you for sharing that.
I agree. Mm-hmm.
So I know we've NWF and you have worked closely with the DC team here for CCL, but what are some other thoughts you have on how we can best be in the movement together? What are some ways that you think CCL is already helpful or could be even more helpful or effective? Open to your thoughts.
Yeah, well, CCL has made a huge impact in raising the awareness level on Capitol Hill, certainly sorry for the noise in the background, about what carbon pricing even is. I think it's really encouraged members from across the political spectrum to pay attention to climate change and recognize that constituents in every member's district actually is concerned about and cares about climate change. And so I think that you can really see this desire to show responsiveness to climate and climate concerns from just a variety of members on the Hill, which is really a great change. And as someone who's been in the space for a long time, that's really noticeable. And I think it's just uniquely attributable to CCL. And something that in terms of what I would really love to work with you all and other partners on moving forward, once we get past this reconciliation bill craziness, is what the next phase looks like for advancing carbon pricing, and other supportive policies too. But as you alluded to, as significant as this package of policies or investments is that's before Congress right now, it's just not enough. That's because of the state of the climate crisis we're in. We've just waited so long to make real emissions reductions that we're going to have to. All the science continues to say this, with increasing alarm every year. That the reductions are just going to have to be more dramatic and speedy, as well as deep, the longer we wait. So I think at some point, not too far from now, probably something like a price is going to finally be realized as like the best way to get at it. There's just going to be gaps in other sorts of things we've tried to put forward. And this will be the most cost-effective and quick, efficient way to do it. And that it can be designed equitably. I think that there's also been a fear up until now that every carbon pricing proposal is the same and they're all going to fail to actually help people. And will just make everything more costly. And obviously we know that's not true, but there's a lot of education still to be done on the details that we haven't really had the opportunity to do right now in this harried sort of reconciliation moment. So my hope is that there will be that, continued interest in filling those gaps after this package is done. And because this is an increasingly bipartisan solution, and we may lose the House to a Republican control or vice versa, right. Senate, this will be one of those few things that continues to come up as actually feasible, because there have been some really strong Republican leaders who have expressed interest in this. Mitt Romney apparently is continuing to say, even recently, why are the Democrats not including a carbon fee in this reconciliation proposal? So I think that plus gathering more information through this process right now will enable us to see where Congress is on a price better than we've known in a while, or at least speaking for NWF, you all might have a better sense because you do so much legwork. But anyway, so picking up those pieces and working with CCL and others, I think early next year to map out a new strategy for sort of what is the new moment on carbon fee, I think really does have potential. So I think that's exciting. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I have to say on the awareness piece by offices, I think we have to give all the credit to our volunteers on that. They are terrific and committed and passionate people that just do great work. I know that, you know, we as CCL staff work hard to like give them the tools and put them in the right position, but they really then go out and, you know, make it happen. So I think I have to give them all the credit for that, and appreciate you saying that. I think it speaks volumes about our volunteers. On the other piece, you know, I think you touched on something that is exactly how CCL feels, which is, you know, absolutely this is, if you just look at the tax credits and these other things that have been proposed on the climate side, it is a massive investment that is sorely needed and are by no means opposed to doing those things.
Right.
But the question becomes, are you actually achieving the final goal? So, you know, of course, we're not going to say no to these investments, but it's more like no or yes, but also we need more. And how do we get there? So I think, you know, there's this place where you have to kind of support and champion the things that are being done, but still say like, there's a lot more to go here. And we haven't quite done enough. And then, you know, I'm certain that I speak for CCL and for the government affairs team. You know, we've started to ask ourselves those questions. What does it look like at the end of this year? What does it look like next year? In the midst of the reconciliation process, there's just barely the bandwidth to even begin those thoughts or conversations. But we have tried to start them internally. And I think, you know, we welcome the opportunity to work together when we have time to sit down and have that conversation about where we all think, and welcome your input about where we all think the space is going.
And after we all take a little break, maybe.
That's right. Little breather. I know we need to give our volunteers a breather too. I think I think we've been asking a lot of them, and they've been troopers, but I think everybody's going to need a breather.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, my next question was for you to, you know, elaborate on NWF's feelings about a price on carbon, but I think you've done that plenty. I don't think we need to touch on that. But on an unrelated note, then we'll jump into audience questions, audience Q&A. You know, what's on the top of your stack when you have time to read, when you're not, you know, focused on reconciliation? What have you been reading or read lately that you'd recommend to our volunteers and others?
Yes, reading. I've been trying to do more of it. I often find myself gravitating to like science fiction and fantasy, things that are not, you know, based in reality, because reality is plenty these days. But lately I'm trying a little bit different tack. I just started a book that's really quite good called Cutting for Stone by Abraham, I think Verghese is how it's pronounced. And it's a novel about twins born in an Ethiopian mission hospital in the 1950s to an Indian nun and a British surgeon. So it's just already just sort of, you know, very different there and different kinds of characters. And it just paints a really interesting and sort of fascinating picture of different people and they, you know, travel across sort of different lands and encounter different sort of trials and tribulations, and it's against the backdrop of civil unrest. So anyway, it's really good. I mean, great sort of unusual story. I recommend that. But otherwise, I'm doing a lot of Netflix.
Unplugging your brain for a little bit. I understand.
Yes.
Well, with that, I'm going to jump into some audience questions.
Sure.
So this question starts, thanks, Shannon. We love listening to you and working with your colleague at NWF, Mustafa Santiago Ali.
Oh, yep.
He's been a former conference keynote of CCL's as well. How does your work intersect with his environmental justice, climate, and community revitalization work? And what specific policies or bills are of most interest in that space to NWF?
Oh, what a great question. That's a big one. We work really closely with Mustafa. Mustafa actually report to Mustafa. And so he does have oversight of our climate work, though our environmental justice work is both its own independent team as well as sort of integrated into all of our other programmatic work. So I guess the way to answer that is we apply an environmental justice lens to how we look at our policy solutions to make sure that they, as kind of I alluded to before, try to help the most disadvantaged folks, certainly do no harm, but just try to think about kind of the ramifications of, it's so easy for us in the policy bubble to just think about everything at a very macro level, right? To increasingly think about how it can have, on the ground real life impacts, especially in, a lot of what and I think you all probably deal in a lot of the time is technology. I mean, a lot of the climate space is really spent thinking about energy technologies and maybe increasingly sort of industry kind of issues. And technology is inherently very complicated and has a lot of real world kind of complex manifestations of sort of how it's deployed and whether people are engaged in the process. And
it's hard to predict that.
Yeah, and it's building off of a pretty terrible legacy, right, of fossil fuels. And so something like carbon capture and carbon removal is an area that we're really trying, for example, to answer the question about what we're doing specifically on our team, is to really think about how to advance something that we think is needed as a climate solution, but do it in an equitable and responsible way. And also with regards to wildlife too, by the way, because a lot of these technologies also can have wildlife implications. So that's where we're trying to spend a lot of our time and energy, knowing that there's plenty of people who advocate for all of these things, but trying to think of the intersections is increasingly what we're doing. So hope that answers the question.
From my perspective, it does. And there's something you said that I think is super accurate. And that is often, the DC bubble, you think of things pretty esoterically, and you don't really get down to, it's just like, oh, well, this seems like a good policy, it'll work. And, that's just kind of how you operate. And it's hard. I shouldn't say it's hard. It's easy to get led down the path where you stop thinking about the knock-on implications further down the chain after you've passed the policy. So I think that's really meaningful and difficult work to try and think through that and make sure you have the right assumptions and all those things. That's tough. So I commend you all.
Yep. And I don't claim to have any answers on any of it, but trying to figure it out and do better. And one thing that I think that would love to work with you all and just a whole bunch of people on to figure out is how to do all of that and also be responsive to the pace that policy happens, because they're kind of in conflict, and that's a problem, right? Because there's still that translation aspect to the Hill that isn't really happening about environmental justice needs. So that's another need that we got to work on, is try to make sure that we're not the only ones applying that lens, but also the policymakers are doing it too. So, well,
to the answer your question of whether it was a good answer, our volunteer responded, "Great, thank you for the helpful explanation, and please tell him that hello."
Okay, will do.
Moving to our next question. This question is a little bit more specific, maybe. Does NWF have programs related to or for reforestation and afforestation? And if so, can you describe them? And are there any other programs that are focused on carbon sequestration?
Yeah, we do. So our forestry work is, I guess you could say it's sort of a jointly structured, I guess that's inside baseball, that isn't so important, but a number of us work on forest restoration and conservation related issues. Originally probably NWF did that from the wildlife perspective, to try to protect and maintain habitat, improve habitat, expand habitat for wildlife. But we're also, and have been for a little while now, increasingly doing that for its climate benefit too, both in terms of expanding the carbon sink and protecting the existing sink, but also boosting resilience of forests in order to better protect wildlife and human communities too. And so, so we do, quite a fair bit on that as well. Afforestation is a little trickier for us. We tend to focus on restoring and improving management of forests, and then improving the health of forests rather than necessarily tree planting, though we do that too, but just focus on sort of the ecologically appropriate way to do that. And we actually have a separate program that's more of kind of an education program that that actually works with local communities to do native tree planting and such, like on school grounds and other places. Yeah, we kind of run the gamut, and we also have a small urban forestry program that hopefully will be growing, because that's increasingly being recognized as another important way to both store carbon, but also improve local environments for cities. So, yeah. And we increasingly throughout just on other natural climates, we call it natural climate solutions and natural infrastructure, lots of different terms, increasingly are approaching our coastal restoration work, our agriculture work, and other sorts of, and we have a kind of a native grasses and prairie related conservation work, increasingly approaching a lot of that from a carbon as well as climate resilience lens too. So yeah, all very integrated.
So, I mean, just the breadth of all of what you all are focused on is really, I think my takeaway so far from our conversation is just how immense like how broad the focus that you all had is. As you mentioned over and over, it is all related, but it is so hard to try to focus on so many things and to do it well. I think it's my impression is that you do both, but that's a difficult challenge to do that.
Yeah, it is hard. We definitely have luckily a good combination of people who are deeper in each of these things than I am. And so especially when it comes to the natural solutions, I'm more of a kind of a hub and sort of facilitating conversations than anything else. But yeah, it's good to have a combination of the policy and the kind of other expertise.
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit with this question. Obviously, speaking of bandwidth, coalition building takes a lot of bandwidth, and not every group is focused on some of the things that CCL is focused on or NWF is focused on. How important has working with other groups been for NWF? And do you have any particular groups or organizations other than CCL who you've done some work closely with us on a number of occasions that you partner with regularly, or are good partners that you look to on a regular basis?
Yeah, it's interesting. We do so much work through coalitions that it actually makes me wonder sometimes when I have time to sort of look up from what I'm doing to wonder, is this how everyone in the work world does everything? Because it's certainly how we do things. It's just so much coalition work. And I think that, it can have its frustrations at times, right? Because it's hard to have everyone always agree on details of things. And that certainly can happen. But it's clearly a way to bring strength to what we work on. And I guess as far as who, it actually kind of depends on the issue a little bit. So carbon capture definitely involves, I would say, a largely different set of partners than clean energy standards, policy, or tax credit work or something like that. So where, I guess, to just oversimplify a little bit, a lot of the clean energy space, I would say, is sort of we work mostly with your sort of green group allies, your major national environmental nonprofits, and then also some renewable trade association types, especially on tax credits. We've been partnering up on that. When it comes to carbon capture, that often includes more of the kind of the businesses as well, who are trying to kind of, a lot of startups, as you might imagine, in that space, in some piece of that chain, especially in like the carbon use after capture, sort of this mind-blowing.
It's so nascent. Yeah, it's so nascent.
So nascent, yeah. So there's a lot of sort of, learning from each other that goes on there. And then carbon pricing is yet another, I found, slightly different group. It tends to be a little bit more centrist, or at least these days. I don't think it was always that way. 10 years ago, it wasn't that way. So I tend to work, so I tend to work with you all, with Nature Conservancy, C2ES, if you guys know them.
Yeah.
Other groups like WRI, World Resources Institute, and some think tanks. So yeah, it's a little bit of a different set of groups depending on the topic. And then of course, labor, we are members of the Blue Green Alliance, if you all know them.
I was just going to ask,
yeah, and partner with them on specific things too, especially where there's an intersection with like business and protecting but pushing business to be more green and to put workers first. And so
I was just going to say, especially with how much of these current proposals are tied up in infrastructure and other programs that are job creating programs as much as they are clean or climate programs.
Exactly.
It makes a lot of sense that, Blue Green would be pretty active and that you would be working with them closely. No, thank you for sharing that. I think, I find that as well. on even from issue to issue on just specifically business outreach, your partners on every issue can be very different, even within industry or corporations. So there's no question that you have to be nimble and have lots of different, working coalitions at the same time. Well, then another question we had that came in from our volunteers are, what are some of NWF's favorite nature-based climate policies that you're supporting or researching?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, well, here's some that, at least speaking for myself, we probably have different views across the organization, but one that comes to mind that might not immediately be something that everyone thinks of that I'm really fascinated in and want to see take hold more is reclaimed, abandoned either mines like coal mines or hard rock mines, or orphaned wells, kind of reclaiming and restoring those areas so that they're not only, safer environmentally and, kind of restore any sort of any damage, but actually kind of move them into carbon sink sort of status. So whether it's, reforesting those areas or replanting native prairies, whatever is appropriate for that region, really turning sort of blighted areas that are hazardous or not economically productive anymore into productivity for the climate, right, and protection of local health and environment. So that's something that I think is uniquely sort of NWF about us, because we have a lot of work that we do through our public lands program, through that we try to advocate for leasing a reform for our oil and gas wells. And we also do a lot of work, like I mentioned earlier, in Appalachia to work with groups to, advance energy transition related needs for communities that are really in decline because of the decline of coal. Right. And putting together all of these, plus our interest in creating wildlife habitat, all of these things together kind of make for a uniquely NWF sort of approach, perhaps, to turning these into carbon sinks is the kind of the best way to put it, and just adding this marginal land or otherwise degraded land to the hopefully increasing supply of kind of natural carbon sinks out there.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting stuff. And one of the things that comes to my mind is some of these sites are quite large. In pure acreage, they can be quite large. So there's real opportunity there that I hadn't given a lot of thought to, but that was the thing that came to my mind when you started to describe it.
Yeah.
Well, a kind of related question that I think is a little bit more fun and off the beaten path that just came in from a volunteer is, any fun ideas on how wildlife can help raise awareness for putting a price on carbon?
Well, we definitely use wildlife. That sounds bad. We use wildlife all the time to get people to care about climate, right? Because a lot of the people in our membership base, a lot of them are there just because of wildlife and not necessarily there because of climate, first and foremost. And so it's through wildlife we make that connection. And we sort of joke sometimes that we have a different species for a different issue. For some reason, the moose is how we got people engaged in carbon pricing in the past, because it's just such an iconic, unfortunately, indicator of climate change. As you all might know, the warming weathers, especially in the temperatures in the Northeast, have meant that ticks are not killed off in the winter. And so they hang on literally to moose and kind of overpopulate and okay, now I'm getting depressing, but they really make it very hard for a moose to kind of thrive because they just, eat ticks that basically just suck all their blood and make them very weak and sick. So that is something, if you think about that hunter-angler base, right, a lot of those hunters really value moose. And there's actually some revenues in different states, like in New Hampshire, where we have an organizer that's really, created a lot of awareness based on the moose, where, revenue is generated from the hunting licenses that, associate with moose and such. So that became, one of our sort of iconic figures when we've done carbon pricing campaigns before. We've connected with people about sort of clean energy and the grid, kind of improving the grid to songbirds, believe it or not. That was a connection that we were able to make with our audience. So there's different ways to do it. As far as a more specific, I don't know if we can make it more specific that a particular policy will be good for a particular species, but certainly addressing climate change. We have a number of species that we definitely can kind of illustrate both the impact of climate change, unabated climate change too, and then the benefit of policy too. So yeah, we do that pretty regularly. If you ever check out our website and look at our action alerts at nwf.org, look at our action alerts, they usually have some sort of species front and present.
Well, I was just about to say, I think some of our viewers may go look for those carbon pricing and moose advertisements or ads or whatever you had. That's, I mean, it is sad, but also like, that's pretty, as you mentioned, like a moose is pretty iconic, hard to miss a moose.
Mm-hmm. And there's different regions. So I guess one last thing I'll just mention is when we talked a lot about methane a couple of years ago, which was sort of associated with Western, oil and gas development, we really connected with people through the pronghorn antelope, which is kind of an iconic species out west too. So and how they're already challenged by oil and gas development, and then this sort of adds to the challenge for them. So there's definitely ways to do it.
That's great. Thank you. No, those are all super interesting. Well, I think that about wraps it up for our questions. So do you have any closing words of wisdom or reflections for our viewers today?
Well, I don't know about wisdom, but definitely appreciation and, just that I know, or I can imagine that you feel like I do often, which is that you feel both driven to, by the news on climate, to want to bring solutions, right, to pass, and you desperately want to see progress. And I do too, and it's what gets me up in there every morning and wanting to do good. And then it's sort of maddening that, Congress is as far behind as they are. What I can say is just don't give up. It is progress that we're making. It's when you want so much and need so much, it's sometimes hard to see it, but it is important to recognize it when you do see it. So a perfect example being this reconciliation bill right now. It will in fact be, if all goes as expected, the biggest congressional investment ever in climate solutions, which is a big deal. And that is Congress. And someone pointed it out to me earlier today, so he should get credit for this, that we're used to Congress not doing anything, right? The fact that they might spend $555 billion just on climate very shortly is not nothing, and a very divided Congress at that. So it's a good sign, and so it's something to build off of for sure. So I think we need to keep hope and keep pushing, because it is working. It is working. It's just slow.
Well, thank you for sharing that perspective. I couldn't agree more. There are days where it is maddening, no question, or a little bit depressing, but in the grand scheme, you're right. We've made progress, we are making progress, and we can continue to try and make more. So, thank you so much for joining us today. I, really couldn't have asked for a better event. You were so forthcoming with the questions and had some really great answers. So thank you very much. I found it very interesting and fun, and I hope our volunteers and viewers did too. For our viewers, the slide up right now is a brief reminder of where you can find today's recording to share with those that couldn't join us live, as well as our education director, Brett Cease's email, if you have any comments, questions, or feedback. And lastly, here's the website for both Citizens Climate Lobby and NWF if you'd like to get more involved and active, as well as the registration link for next month's talk. Thanks again to Shannon and for all the important work that NWF is doing. We are so appreciative to have a great partner like NWF, and we just thank you. So stay safe and be well, everybody.
Likewise, thank you all. Really appreciate everything you're doing.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.